Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch, the show that brings you the best analysis of major international developments. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. In today's edition of the show, we will discuss the landmark outcomes of the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, which concluded in Montreal on December 19. Biodiversity refers to the variety of living species on Earth, including plants, animals, fungi, and even microorganisms like bacteria that make up our natural world. Each of these species and organisms work together in ecosystems, like an intricate web, to maintain balance and support life. Forest ecosystems, agriculture ecosystems, wetlands, and marine ecosystems are storehouses of biodiversity. But as humans put increasing pressure on the planet, using and consuming more resources than ever before, we risk upsetting the balance of ecosystems and endangering the Earth's magnificent biodiversity. The World Wildlife Fund's 2022 Living Planet report found an average 69% decline in global populations of mammals, fish, birds, reptiles, and amphibians since 1970. Approximately 1 million animal and plant species are now threatened with extinction, the highest number in human history, driven by human actions, including deforestation, burning fossil fuels, and polluting rivers and oceans. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, was a belated recognition that biological diversity is a global asset, but is also threatened by human activity. This international treaty, that came into force on December 29, 1993, now has 196 signatories. The CBD made each country responsible for managing its own biodiversity and had three main objectives. 1. The conservation of biological diversity. 2. The sustainable use of components of biological diversity. And 3. The fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, which led to the Nagoya Protocol of 2014. A conference of parties to the CBD was held annually for 3 years after 1994 and thence biennially on even-numbered years. The COP15 Biodiversity Summit took place between December 6 and 19 in Montreal. The main objective of COP15 was to adopt an ambitious and balanced global biodiversity framework to replace the Aichi biodiversity targets, which expired in 2020 and were considered a failure by many experts. After 2 weeks of negotiations, 196 countries, including India, adopted a landmark agreement to halt and reverse the unprecedented decline in biodiversity. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is being likened to the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, aims to implement broad-based action to bring about a transformation in our society's relationship with biodiversity by 2030, in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. The agreement includes 23 targets and 4 goals to protect nature that the world needs to achieve by 2030. The headline goal, called 30 by 30, is to protect 30% of land and 30% of coastal and marine areas by 2030, up from the current level of 17% for land and 10% for marine areas. The framework also aspires to stop the extinction of known species and by 2050 reduce tenfold the extinction risk and rate of all species and reduce risk from pesticides by at least 50% by 2030. The framework also includes an agreement to reform $500 billion of subsidies that are harmful to nature and to increase biodiversity financing to developing countries by ensuring that $200 billion per year is mobilized from public and private sources for conservation initiatives. Each country will set its national action plan, which will be reviewed periodically. To discuss the global biodiversity framework and India's position in greater detail, I will now call upon 2 top experts. Joining us from Chennai is Mr. J. Justin Mohan, Secretary of the National Biodiversity Authority, An officer of the 1999 batch of the Indian Forest Service from Kerala Kada, he is a committed conservationist who has been the recipient of the Global Tiger Forum Award, Wildlife Trust of India Award, and the Nilgiri Wildlife Prize for contributions to wildlife conservation. And with me in the studio is Ms. Archana Chatterjee, Project Manager at the International Union for Conservation of Nature. She has more than 17 years of experience with non-governmental and UN organizations on issues related to biodiversity. Let me begin with you, Mr. Mohan. You were there in Montreal, attending the full session of COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. How significant was COP15 compared to earlier COPs?
Thank you very much, sir, for this opportunity. I was very fortunate to be part of this COP15 at Montreal. I attended the entire session. In fact, it was a landmark conference, sir. Because unlike the previous conferences, there were two visible events that have happened. One was that we have a 10-year framework now, which is popularly called as the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which incorporates 4 larger goals and 23 targets. We had a similar framework in 2010, which was called the Aichi targets, also popularly referred to as the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity for the period 2011 to 2020. But this post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is slightly different from the Aichi targets in the sense that here every target now has a numerical value to it. Earlier it was all qualitative, now they have made it quantitative. This was one difference from the earlier targets which Convention on Biological Diversity had for countries to implement various programs for biodiversity conservation. The other major event of this conference was the fact that the world community recognized the importance of financing, particularly the resource mobilization, because there was a lot of financial gap between the requirements for biodiversity conservation and what was actually being invested for biodiversity conservation. So the world community went ahead and came up with the financial requirement for biodiversity conservation. These two are the major outcomes of the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Of course, within the targets, we have several targets which can bring more funds for the developing countries, including India, like, for example, the digital sequence information, where developed countries can access biological resources using genetic engineering, using the digital sequence of biological resources without physically accessing them. So now the BSA has already also been brought into the benefit sharing mechanism under Target 13. Similarly, the lifestyle mission of our Honorable Prime Minister has also been brought into the global biodiversity target to reduce wastage, to reduce consumption, unnecessary consumption. Similarly, the world community has brought in an high ambition coalition's agenda to conserve 30% of the land and 30% of the seas under conservation.
Thank you for that very comprehensive overview of what the COP15 achieved. But Ms. Chatterjee, the agreement has also been criticized for lacking quantifiable pledges around relating to production and consumption, which are key drivers of biodiversity loss. It is also not legally binding. I mean, countries have agreed to a monitoring framework to evaluate progress, but there are no binding commitments. So how will the new framework ensure that it does not go the Aichi way?
Okay, so let me start with the 2018 COP for CBD, which identified that the targets that were adopted, the Aichi targets in 2010, the progress has not been achieved. And one of the major failures because of which it was not done was that there was not a monitoring framework in place, and the nations could not monitor and report on it. And this has been sort of recognized in a big way in this particular COP, although we don't have a binding framework in place, target in place in this COP also. However, what needs to be done is that the countries, when they are revising their national biodiversity strategy action plans, should build these science-linked indicators into their NBSAPs and transparently report on it in the the regular reports that go to the COP Secretariat. The other thing is that in one of the targets, the companies, one of the impacts is from the large transnational companies, financial institutions when they are making investment decisions. So I think there is in one of the targets, it's very clearly stated that the national governments must bring into policies and legal, solutions by which the companies can transparently report on their risks, dependencies and impacts on biodiversity. So this could be another way of tracking the progress towards our attainment of these 23 targets. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Mohan, what were India's objectives at COP15 and were they met substantially?
Sir, India has been participating in the CBD process for the last 4 years prior to this COP15, sir. And India had its own challenges. You already know that we are cruising towards a population of 1.4 billion. About 1 billion people are directly dependent on biodiversity for their livelihood in the rural areas and the forest areas. We have an agrarian ecosystem with more than 65% of our population dependent on agriculture. So we had our own challenges to implement certain targets that were put forth by the convention. And our Honorable Union Minister for Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Shri Bhupendra Yadavji, had articulated India's position at the conference. And some of our recommendations were incorporated, like, for example, the lifestyle mission for environment articulated by our Honorable Minister was in fact brought in as one of the targets to reduce consumption, unnecessary wastage of biodiversity in the form of food and other components of our life. Similarly, India had its own challenges to meet the growing population's requirement in terms of food security and also the energy requirement, power requirement, and infrastructure requirement. So there was a delicate balance between the environment and the development agenda for the government, between the environment and the economy. So we had taken our proposals to the COP, many of which were accepted, though we had some reservations on some numerical targets which were covered in 4 targets. But by and large, we feel that most of our requirements were taken care. In fact, India became a member of the High Ambition Coalition to bring 30% of the land and sea under conservation, which was also agreed to by the COP. So overall, I feel that it is an aspiration of the convention to bring in a biodiversity conservation network among all these 196 parties of the convention. I feel that India can benefit out of the achievements which we have done till date and our future plans for biodiversity conservation in our country.
Ms. Chatterjee, now tensions over how to finance global conservation proved to be a particular sticking point at COP15. What, according to you, are the big challenges for successful implementation of the decisions of COP15?
Right. So finance has always been an issue, whether it is the CBD COP or the UNFCCC COP, and the tension between the developed and the developing countries and the flow of finance, not only in financial terms, in money terms, but also in terms of technology transfer, capacity building, and technical know-how. In my view, in this COP, although the financial was again a sticking point, but I think good progress has been made by recognizing the need for the special fund that will be set up, the GBF fund as it is being called under the GEF.
Beyond the Global Environmental Facility.
Yes, beyond the Global Environmental Facility. So this could be a good source of fund, especially for the least developed countries and small island nations, which are really facing the day-to-day impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. The other important thing is that it has been recognized for now that the climate change issues cannot be resolved till biodiversity issues are addressed. These are both joined at the hip. And therefore, it is very important that the the financial options that are available more in the climate sector are repurposed and guided towards solutions which integrate biodiversity also. So this could be one more, I would say opportunity rather than a challenge. But yes, challenge in terms of the right policies and the governance mechanisms.
Mr. Mohan, now India is one of 17 mega diverse countries and home to 10% of the world's species. So how has India contributed to global biodiversity conservation?
Since the Stockholm Conference, that is the United Nations Conference on Environment, which took place in 1972, India has enacted several legislations to conserve our agriculture ecosystems, forest ecosystems, to ensure that a comprehensive legal framework is available for conserving our biodiversity. And ever since India became party to the Convention on Biological Diversity in 1992, India enacted the Biological Diversity Act and framed the rules in 2004. And also we have an access and benefit sharing regulations that was notified in 2014, subsequent to when India became party to the Nagoya Protocol. So we have a comprehensive legal framework in place to conserve our biodiversity. Also, we have institutions in place. We have several departments dedicated to protect our forests, our agriculture, our soils, our fishery resources, and animal husbandry resources. Also, at the national level, we have the National Biodiversity Authority. At the state level, every state has a state biodiversity board. Union territories have the union territory biodiversity councils. And at the grassroots level, at the local body level, we have the biodiversity management committees. Today, we have about 2.77 lakh biodiversity management committees functioning in all the local bodies. These institutions have been established under the Biological Diversity Act with specific duties, responsibilities, and functions to perform, to take care of our biodiversity. Government has also been implementing several schemes aimed at conserving our biodiversity. Many of the schemes have now been mainstreaming to biodiversity conservation. For example, the soil health card scheme, which was implemented by the Government of India since 2014, we have distributed close to 230 million soil health cards to the farmers, which have guided them for optimum application of fertilizers in the soil to enhance soil health, at the same time improve their yield and reduce the cost of cultivation. Similarly, government is also moving towards bringing in more farmers for organic cultivation. So both at the agricultural front as well as the forest front, we have a competent and comprehensive mechanism to protect our biodiversity. In fact, several national parks, we have about 104 national parks today, 533 wildlife sanctuaries. We have about 53 tiger reserves, 33 elephant reserves. We have Ramsar sites, about 75 Ramsar sites. And similarly, community reserves. We have a lot of biodiversity heritage sites in 15 states. So the list of areas that have been brought under conservation and the effective mechanism for benefit sharing under the Nagoya Protocol, these are all lot of achievements from the Indian side. In fact, we have mobilized close to 1.6 billion rupees as access and benefit sharing funds from the corporates. Similarly, biodiversity has also been incorporated under the corporate social responsibility, under which the companies can fund biodiversity conservation in rural areas. These are some of the major achievements so far as biodiversity conservation is concerned. In fact, the National Biodiversity Authority has, with the recommendation of the several states, we have notified close to 334 species which were on the verge of extinction, so that we can take due diligence whenever approval is granted for corporate entities. Similarly, we have established 17 repositories which have been notified under the provisions of the Biological Diversity Act, where voucher specimens have to be kept by the companies who are extracting biological resources in large quantities, so that even if such species goes extinct, there is a voucher species in place so that we ensure that these species do not get extinct.
Now, Ms. Chatterjee, the framework also includes language to protect indigenous people who have an outsized role protecting the world's biodiversity, but have often been overlooked and in some cases even forced from their own lands in the name of conservation. How significant is the involvement of local communities in protecting biodiversity?
Absolutely. I would like to refer to the State of Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Land and Territories report, which has been brought out recently by IUCN, WWF and a host of other organizations, and I would like to quote from it. saying that in total 91% of the indigenous people and local communities' lands are considered to be in good or fair ecological conditions, and at least 36% of the global land area that is covered currently by identified key biodiversity areas lies in these indigenous people's lands. So therefore, we can easily correlate that these are the custodians of biodiversity, and without their support, we cannot go much ahead. The other point I would like to reiterate, I have been doing so in many discussions, that while the 30 by 30 is a great target, but it is the other 70% that is outside this 30% that is really impacting this 30%. And that is where we need to focus our attention. 30% is in good hands, Forest Service, Government of India, protected areas, so on and so forth. But it is the other 70% which is in people's hands, where we need to make the real decisions, the real capacity building of the people to take care. So therefore, it is very, very important. I think the COVID has also taught us a lot in a way that biodiversity is indispensable, whether it is for climate change or is it for our own, well-being.
Now, Mr. Mohan, you mentioned that India is now a member of the High Ambition Coalition. How does India plan to achieve the objectives of this coalition to bring 30% of the land and sea under conservation?
So this High Ambition Coalition is an association of 117 countries at present, sir, that includes India as well. This concept was put forth by France and Costa Rica, that 30% of the seas and 30% of the land worldwide should be brought under conservation. As you know, some of the countries are landlocked, some are islands. Countries like India have both seas as well as land. So the idea is, if each country can contribute to bring 30% of their terrestrial and marine ecosystems cumulatively, then it would go a long way to conserve 30% of the seas and 30% of the land by 2030. As of now, sir, India has a protective network. Tree cover and forest cover alone contribute to about 24.6% of the geographical area. We have a geographical area of about 321 million square kilometers. So out of which 24.65% is covered by tree and green cover. Similarly, forest and tree cover. We also have a substantial component of eco-sensitive zones which have been earmarked under the Environment Protection Act. We also have Ramsar sites, mangroves. We also have biodiversity heritage sites. These all put together will contribute to another 3%. So we are already there towards 27% of the area under conservation. The remaining 3%, we are aiming at bringing in more areas under the Biological Diversity Act. Certain areas which are rich in biodiversity can be demarcated or notified as a biodiversity heritage site, and there is a specific funding mechanism available in the Act. So we want to bring in more areas under the biodiversity heritage site. Similarly, large chunks of land which are already under conservation, which are already under tree cover, are with the private hands, particularly with the private sector companies and also the public sector companies, and also with the educational institutions, defense cantonments, and so on. So we are in the process of bringing these lands under the OECM network, that is the other effective area-based conservation mechanisms, where the ownership of these lands will continue to remain with those private or public sector units, but these will be recognized as conservation areas.
Ms. Chatterjee, Prime Minister Modi has given a clarion call for citizens to adopt the LIFE mission. How can biodiversity conservation be made part of this mission?
So yes, the Lifestyle for Environment, which was launched, which is a global movement that was launched by Honorable Prime Minister on the Environment Day this year, 5th June, calls for all of us, the global citizens, to become pro-planet people. And how can we do this? How can we integrate biodiversity into all this? By taking on the right choices, the right food choices. How much do we question where our food is coming from? Do we enjoy the food which is, imported from high biodiversity areas, causing a carbon footprint, and also maybe some of the food that we eat is grown after destruction of biodiversity in those areas. So by becoming more and more aware of this and moving from use and dispose economy to more circular economy, and this has been captured in one of the targets also, to reduce consumption, wasteful consumption. So all these, I think the more awareness comes into the consumer, making the right food choices, I think that will all lead us into the life mission and become pro-planet people at the end of the day.
Mr. Mohan, India is now holding the presidency of the G20. How can India use this platform for achieving the goals of biodiversity conservation?
So this is a great opportunity, sir. As India is taking over the presidency of the G20. As you know, G20 includes European Union and the United Kingdom. If you take the countries per se, there are 46 countries in this network. So out of these, 40 countries are developed countries with a lot of technology with them. So I see a lot of opportunities for India to project our achievements during the next 1 year, so that the countries can actually take back home a lot of ideas and lot of laws which we are implementing, so that that can be replicated in their own countries. Similarly, there is a lot of potential for developed countries to actually share their technologies for biodiversity conservation, to help our research community to conserve our biodiversity. Similarly, I also see a lot of opportunities for funding. Once the countries who are part of the G20 come to know about India's vision for biodiversity conservation, there is a lot of scope for more funding for biodiversity conservation in our country. And with the digital sequence information being brought under the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, there is a lot of scope for funding biodiversity conservation initiatives in India.
Well, thank you very much, both my panelists, for your insights into the importance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is critical for the survival of all life forms on Mother Earth. Biodiversity is also the source of livelihood for billions of people living in different parts of the world. As the international community moves towards a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, India joins the world to ensure that the biodiversity available in our country is adequately safeguarded. Because unless we all join together to protect this fascinating gift of nature, it will be very late to save our planet and save ourselves. Thank you for watching Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, take care and goodbye.